This is Business Breakdowns. Business Breakdowns is a series of conversations with investors and operators diving deep into a single business. For each business, we explore its history, its business model, its competitive advantages, and what makes it tick. We believe every business has lessons and secrets that investors and operators can learn from, and we are here to bring them to you. To find more episodes of Breakdowns, check out joincolossus.com.
All opinions expressed by hosts and podcast guests are solely their own opinions. Hosts, podcast guests, their employers, or affiliates may maintain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions.
Welcome back to Business Breakdowns. We have another special episode today, diving into the CHIPS Act. Now, we've covered the semiconductor space in depth, most recently with some episodes on Intel, Samsung, and Entegris. But if you go back in the library, we have episodes on AMD, ASML, TSMC, Cadence. So we've gone deep into the micro names in the space. But in this conversation, we go broader. We discuss the CHIPS Act, which was enacted by Congress in 2022, which aimed at boosting the U.S.'s semiconductor manufacturing capabilities to better compete with East Asia. And while the U.S. has stayed at the forefront on chip research and design, our reliance on that foreign supply chain became a massive issue in the summer of 2020 into 2021. And as we were dependent on that foreign manufacturing, it created massive shortages, which had implications across some of our most important resources and defense systems here in the U.S. The CHIPS Act itself provides just under $53 billion in subsidies for U.S. companies. It also provides incentive tax credits and some research budget as well. And this is aimed at companies operating in the U.S. or U.S.-specific companies. The goal of the CHIPS Act is to build out these capabilities with leading-edge logic and memory fabrication, advanced packaging facilities, and advanced capacity for current-generation semiconductors. My guest today is Todd Fisher, CIO of the CHIPS Act office. Todd and the broader U.S. CHIPS Act team bring very unique experience to a government program. Todd worked for 30 years in finance and was a veteran at KKR prior to joining the government and the CHIPS Act program. And over the past year, Todd and his team have allocated a large percentage of that capital towards projects, which we dive into in this discussion. We also discuss some of the broader questions any investor might have about subsidized industry programs, how that will shift the natural free market supply-demand dynamics that you would typically see in industries like semiconductors. It's truly a wide-ranging conversation and particularly timely with the recent funding announcements from the team. So please enjoy this conversation with Todd Fisher. All right, Todd, thank you very much for joining us today. It's a topic that we cover mostly through the companies within the industry here, but it's great to get your perspective on the CHIPS Act and everything happening around it. And I thought one of the best places to start is a measurement of where we are today. I think you laid out in your Vision for Success publication that 2020 revealed the fragility of the supply chain for chips in the U.S. And I'm just curious, as we stand here in 2024, how you would assess that situation today based on both just the natural market cleaning itself up, but also some of the announcements and different things that have happened in the industry since then.
Well, great. Well, Matt, it's great to be here with you. To answer your question, from a pure supply chain perspective, obviously what the CHIPS Act was put in place to address was a fundamental national and economic security issue that has evolved over decades, where our supply chain is really reliant to a large extent on unique geographical choke points, particularly in places like Taiwan, but not only in places like Taiwan, that created a lack of resiliency. That multi-decade evolution of an industry will not go away in any given year or two. So our whole goal is to shift that dramatically, and so that we can see the kink in the curve where it's come down but then goes up. This was brought very much home in the pandemic, where everybody noticed you couldn't get your car because of some 50 cent or $2 microprocessor or some other type of chip that dealt with windshield wipers on a car. And we saw that fragility of the supply chain real time. That has obviously dissipated to a large extent in the system on its own. The semiconductor industry is a cyclical industry despite high cyclical growth trends. And over the last couple of years, that industry, parts of that industry, memory, clear and mature, have turned down and inventory has built. And so we are not sitting here today, other than in certain components of the industry, in a constrained supply chain environment. But that is exactly the time where we need to build the resiliency. It's like you don't want to be buying the insurance and putting a new roof on and hurricane shutters on when the wind's blowing. You want to do that during the sunny times. And that's what we're doing right now. We, I think, have made a very significant amount of progress in our program. We can talk some more about some of the recent reports that have come out that are a couple years from the last one that show the progression of the industry over the last couple of years and over the next decade. And I feel that we are making very good progress on bringing a significant amount of semiconductor manufacturing capacity onshore and into allied countries and really building fundamental economic and national security through supply chain resiliency.
You hit on a lot there that I want to get into. One of the first things off the bat, you mentioned it was a multi-decade shift towards all of this manufacturing happening offshore, and it's going to take some time to see that inflect and then move back in the right direction. When you're approaching the various funding projects, you have different segments that you're looking to fund. If there's a way that you could simplify that, whether it's on a project basis, in terms of how you're looking to create sustainable onshore or domestic funded projects, manufacturing, all of the different segments that you've talked about. How do you go about approaching that? Whether you want to use numbers, whether you want to use qualitative aspects of it, just some simplification of the funding itself is really helpful, especially since you've announced quite a few recently.
Well, let me give you a sense of the broad numbers of the program so you have that. CHIPS Act was $50+ billion. Of that, $39 billion is manufacturing incentives. That's where I sit. And then there's $11 billion that's R&D. So $39 billion of direct incentives, together with a couple of other tools, investment tax credit, which is a very important tool. We have loans and loan guarantees, which are up to $75 billion, which we can talk a little bit about. And then, of course, there are state and local incentives. And to get a CHIPS Act award, you do need to have engaged with a state or locality and some incentives from them. So those are the government incentive programs that we have. Now, just to give you some scale, like $39 billion, while in aggregate it seems and feels like a lot of money, in the context, as you well know, of the kind of industry we're talking about here, where a single leading edge fab could cost $20 to $25 billion, it is not a significant amount of capital. In fact, if you look at the SIA report, they would say that over the next decade, there'll be about $2.3 trillion invested in the industry, and about 28% of that would be in the U.S. That's about $650 billion. We have $39 billion to try to impact that $650 billion. And so we are taking every opportunity to crowd in capital and to align our interests, and so that we're using our capital in the most effective way to drive the most effective outcomes. So that's the broad layout of the program. We have said that for the direct incentives, those incentives people should expect will be approximately 5 to 15% of the overall capital expenditures spent on a project. That is not an absolute hard and fast rule that we've set, but an expectation. And in fact, if you look at what we've announced to date we've announced up to $29.5 billion of incentives through our preliminary memorandum of terms. And that is over $300 billion of aggregate investment that would come along with that. So approximately 10 to 1 for every dollar we're putting up, other money is being crowded in for the rest of that structure.
It's really helpful framing, I think. And when you can tie that $29 billion to that overall aggregate gross number, I think it brings it to life quite a bit. When you're thinking about these projects, we can get into the cost structure challenges and disadvantages potentially of the U.S. relative to elsewhere. But just as you're approaching it and thinking about the sustainability of these projects, I'm sure that's something on your mind. You don't want to be throwing at funds for something that puts money into the ground and then it never gets up and off and running. What have been the biggest breakthroughs or things that have brought that into making your entire project feel comfortable and the funds actually being allocated Because I'm sure that's a challenge. You come from the investment world, you've looked at many projects, you have to pass or invest. How have you gotten comfortable with the sustainability of these projects?
It's a very good question. A couple of things to take into account. A, this is a effort of engaging with large-scale, highly professional, generally well-capitalized companies that are not in crisis. So sort of industrial policy that really the U.S., if ever, maybe never has done, but certainly not for many, many, many years. And so we take this responsibility super seriously. We're also not trying to distort a market. We're trying to create sustainable commercial opportunities across the board. That's really important. Number two, I do come from the private equity and investment world. We're all the sum part of our experiences. And in coming here and thinking about how to set up an investment office within the Commerce Department, I do bring that experience to bear. We are looking to make really good investments. We're not looking for dollars returns. We're looking for economic and national security returns on our investments. And we're looking to make those investments in the best way possible to get the most for our dollars. And we take very seriously the fact that every dollar we're spending is your and my and other people's taxpayer dollars at work. And so we take that responsibility very seriously. So what does that mean in terms of your question? First of all, in both the design and execution, we are mindful of how do we create sustainable commercial opportunities. In the design, the core design is something I just mentioned. We are 10% of what I just said of the capital that's investing. So that whole private equity thing, but alignment of interest. Everybody's got skin in the game. We're putting 5 to 15% up. There's some investment tax credit. There's significant money coming from the companies themselves. That aspect has an ability of aligning interests and making sure what's going in the ground is going in for the right reasons, not for distorted reasons. That's number one. Number two, let's remember what we're not trying to do is just create incremental capacity no matter what. A lot of what we're talking about, you look at our announcement for TSMC, 3 fabs in the US. This is not just 3 incremental fabs. This is, if they were going to do X number of fabs, they probably would all have been in Taiwan. Now 3 of those X will be in the US. And that might be the same for Samsung, et cetera. So I don't want people to be thinking about this as this is all incremental capacity. It's not. In many cases, it's shifting something that might have been done in one region for another. And then the way we execute this is in a classic investment perspective. Importantly, maybe we'll talk about the team later on. I'm really proud of the team we've recruited and developed here, which needed to be a team that could go toe-to-toe with these highly sophisticated companies. And we have built relationships with these companies. We have built relationships with their customers. We need to understand the demand signals in the market. We need to understand what customers are asking for and what they really want, and make sure when we're doing our work, we're understanding what the long-term viability of these entities are. And that's the way we approach it as a typical investor would. Will this be able to be commercially viable over time? And then we structure our awards in a way to make sure that happens. It's not dollars at the door day one. It's dependent on milestones, construction progress, et cetera.
You brought up another interesting point there just in working with TSMC and with the Samsung. I think many patriots of the U.S. immediately get a little shell shock when they see international businesses receiving these awards. You laid into a little bit of the details there in terms of those projects coming into the U.S. Can you talk a bit more about those dynamics in terms of U.S. entities versus foreign entities and how you prioritize the goals in terms of something being done domestically, something being done domestically by a domestic entity, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, I feel like I have one major job, and that is to build the economic and national security of the United States. That is my job. My job is not to reward a U.S. company versus a separate company. However, and we've been very clear about this in our funding opportunity, what we are looking for is companies that will be here and that will invest here over the long time, that will invest in the overall ecosystem. And that means the supply chain, putting R&D dollars on the ground in this country, building the workforce in this country. And if you're doing all those things, and we can talk about some of the announcements we've made, then we want to incent that. And that could be a foreign company or that could be a U.S. company. We have some phenomenal U.S. companies, Intel, TI, Microchip. We have great companies in the U.S. that are doing phenomenal things, and we want to work with those companies. And the way this industry has evolved, there are certain choke points and certain technologies that only certain companies today can do. And our job is not to pick winners and losers. Our job is to enable multiple flowers to grow, in effect, and to make sure that more of that happens here on our shores and in our allied ecosystem than in other places.
And I know some of the challenges associated. You have labor dynamics. You also have the not in my backyard, building new things. There's been quite a few awards made, and I know that it was put on the companies to make sure that they were already having those conversations with the local and state governments, as you mentioned before in the conversation. Can you talk a bit about that, just in terms of the progress that you've seen? Obviously, time will tell as these get built out, but some of the progress and your part in helping to assist these companies get across the line, maybe with some of those conversations to the extent that you can be involved.
I would say, first of all, this is really, really hard. We talked early on in this conversation about this industry has developed over decades in a certain way, in certain locations. The supply chain here is immensely complicated. If you look at one ASML EUV machine, the number of component parts in that system itself and the number of first and second and third tier suppliers, it's really quite a complicated supply chain. And we need to be mindful of that and humble about that, because this is really, really hard. And building these fabs, as you probably also know, is a ridiculous undertaking. I don't know if you've been on any of these sites, but these are massive, massive structures doing the most sophisticated, high purity processes anywhere in the globe. So you take some statistics. For example, the amount of concrete in a given fab is 2 times what the amount of concrete that was in the Burj Khalifa. 600,000 cubic meters of concrete versus around 330. If you look at just pure cabling, it's 5,600 miles of cabling that is in a given fab. So these are massive, massive facilities that are 10,000 times cleaner than an operating room in a hospital. So that's the kind of thing we're working on here. And so when you start to think about that and the requirements, whether that's power, whether that's water, whether that's workforce, all of that creates a complex ecosystem that we have not truly invested in this country for many years, because what's happened over the last 35 years is that we've gone from about 40% of the world's semiconductor fabrication capacity to, based on the latest SIA report, about 10%. So our investment in a lot of these areas and the expertise to do this, we need to recreate. And again, that's not a 1 year or 2 year process. It's a multi-year, decade-long process. So our path and our goal is to try to work with, we want the companies to have skin in the game, and they're the execution. They need to do it. We're trying to help, whether that is on the ground in Arizona or Texas or New York or Idaho or any of these places that we've already announced, helping to work with these companies to build effective workforce pathway systems, relationships with state and local economic authorities. We have a whole team around environmental and NEPA that is prioritizing how we help these companies get ahead of the game there, really think through their environmental challenges. So our path is recognizing it's difficult, recognizing these are amongst the largest and most complicated facilities built anywhere in the globe, and then trying to build the resource internally and engaging externally, both the companies and the regions, to help solve these challenges, which are going to continue to come up because it's hard.
One of the things mentioned in that vision for success was the interest and goal to bring leading edge fabrication into the US. And I think with the supply chain issues, a lot of that could have been considered traditional, not necessarily lagging edge, but the mature node, not the leading edge chips, that created challenges. And especially over the past year, there's only been more and more demand for the leading edge chips. I think that's driving a big amount of the CapEx spend. Has that shifted anything with regards to the program relative to where you were in the start, as you've seen this massive demand spike on the leading edge side?
Let me step back for a second and give a little bit of context here. So you've mentioned our vision for success a couple of times, and maybe for the benefit of everyone, what we put out very early on in our efforts back at the very beginning of 2023 was our 4 pillars of our vision for success. I should add a 5th for supply chain, which is our second funding opportunity. And that was that we wanted to create at least 2 leading edge logic clusters in this country. We wanted to create a significant start on building a significant capability around advanced packaging. We wanted to build a commercially competitive leading edge memory business. And we also wanted to selectively try to impact and solve some of the key bottlenecks that came about from the current and mature industry as we saw it in the pandemic. And then finally, we want to build the supply chains that support all of that. We put that out very clearly. We've built on that over time. The secretary about a month or two ago commented that actually we think we're going to be able to build 3 leading edge clusters for leading edge logic. We put out by the end of the decade to have 20% of leading edge logic in this country by the end of the decade. By the way, that's 0% today. Over 90% of that is done in Taiwan, with the rest done in Korea right now. So going from 0% to 20%. The SIA report said we're on track by the early 2030s to be at 28%. So we're on path to do that. So I think from a perspective, we tried very hard because a lot of these government programs, it's whatever comes in the door, you reply to. One of the things I'd love to talk about is how we've approached it differently here. We're trying to figure out what do we really need, and we go proactively out and try to find it. We try to push our applicants to do more, to do things differently, et cetera, so that we're actually trying to reach our strategic goals, not necessarily their strategic goals. And so that was our guiding light and remains our guiding light going forward. With regards to leading edge logic and memory, if you look at what we've announced all 4 of these companies up to $27.5 billion to Micron, Intel, Samsung, TSMC. Not all of that is for leading edge. Some of that is for advanced packaging. Some of that is for R&D. Some of that is even for current and mature. But a good chunk of that is for leading edge. And that is materially more than what was announced even in the wake of the CHIPS Act. In other words, Samsung announced 2 fabs as opposed to 1 fab, plus an advanced packaging facility, plus an R&D facility, plus expanding their Austin site. So our whole effort has been about trying to push companies to do more and develop these broader scaled ecosystem, which will ultimately lead to the cost competitiveness that we need in this country. AI and the demand driver. So when the CHIPS Act passed, when I took this job, AGI, artificial general intelligence, was not even like a word in the lexicon. Right now, you can't go 2 minutes without talking about it. And it is a massive, massive demand driver that we were not anticipating at that time. That is good. That means that there is a real opportunity that we can help on the back of AI create the AI ecosystem from soup to nuts in the U.S., which would be a phenomenal national and economic security priority for this country. And I think that has not really changed our approach. It has just made what we're doing even more important. It means the need for leading edge logic and memory chips is even more important. So the fact that we're able to get TSMC to do a 3rd fab, the amount of investment going on, over $100 billion by Intel, the fact that we have all 3 of the leading edge logic companies committed to their version of 2 nanometer, the most leading edge in the semiconductor industry today, doing it in this country. And we also have Micron doing leading edge high bandwidth memory in this country. Again, we do 0% of that today. There's no high bandwidth memory for AI and other uses being done in this country, is a testament to what's happening in the demand in the industry.
I want to talk about what you are doing differently from a government program versus what traditional funding programs may have looked like. Some of that has to do with the backgrounds of the people involved coming from the investment industry. I think there was a long period of time where people were waiting for these funds to be allocated. We've certainly seen those announcements recently. The feeling that that had something to do with what you'll talk about now, but maybe you can share what has been different about this program.
Yeah, let's go back and think about this. When the CHIPS Act was passed in August 2022, that was around 20 months ago. What I don't think people recognize generally, and I probably didn't recognize it until I came into the government, is that a law is passed, and then what? The reality is there is nothing, particularly for this program, which is new and different and was going to be set up as its own self-contained unit. There are no people, there are no processes, There are no sets of rules, and there's no one focused on executing because you don't even know if the law is going to pass. So day one, Mike and I joined right after Labor Day of 2022. Nobody involved. And so everything to invest $39 billion had to be put in place from that point going forward. So that's what we've been focused on. For that first period, we were maniacally focused on building a team. We now have close to 200 people from zero. And importantly, the investment team, which I'm responsible for, we have 40 to 50 people that we've been able to recruit, almost all of them from very sophisticated investment, financial, consulting, industry backgrounds. And that has been the critical linchpin to trying to be successful here. And that means I've got senior people who spent 2+ decades at Goldman Sachs, at industry players like Synopsys or Intel, or at private equity firms or venture capital firms or McKinsey or other consulting firms. And pulling that talent together was job number one. Job number two was setting a set of processes and rules so that we could tell the industry what they needed to do. That happened in February of 2023. And an ability to really engage. What we didn't want to do, a lot of government programs are, put your application in, we'll go away for multiple months, we'll come back and we'll tell you what we decide. That wasn't going to work here. So the whole idea was, how do we engage with industry? How do we have an iterative and partnership type of approach where we're really trying to understand these companies and trying to get them to do what they need to do and make sure that we're funding the appropriate amount that is going to incentivize them to do what they'd like to do in this country. And so that nature of being able to engage regularly with applicants, engaging externally with other stakeholders, particularly customers, a critical demand signal and need for customers to also be part of the solution here, investors, other private sources of capital, really trying to be able to engage there. That is part of the design of this program that is not typical of most government programs. And then we partnered all of that up with a set of really talented people from a whole series of different policy areas. Workforce. Maybe we talk some about workforce. It is a critical determinant of success for us. And we have a phenomenal workforce team that's worked in that industry for many, many years. Environmental, I've already mentioned our environmental team, which is playing a huge role in getting ahead of some of the potential challenges from an environmental or NEPA perspective. A national security team that, this program is about national security and making sure we have that critical components, the operational security, cybersecurity, protections, et cetera, making sure we have that as well. So engaging these very strong verticals and partnering them up with this investment talent is how we built the team.
On the workforce side, so I understand this correctly, is that team working with the companies and they're building out of the labor pools and training to basically fill all the needs that these projects entail? Is that right?
Yeah, I would say, number one, workforce is one of, if not the most critical components to whether we're actually going to be successful over the next decade. Because we can build a lot of fabs, but we need to have the people. And when I say people, I'm talking everything from PhD and masters in material science to lab technicians to electricians and welders, et cetera, et cetera. And that is a critical determinant, and we need to spend more time on that. And so the team that we have here is doing a couple things. One is evaluating the applications. We have, as part of our application, one of our 6 key success indicators is workforce. We need applicants to put forth their workforce plan and how they're going to execute and have the right people and right talent at their fabs. And that evaluation, our merit review approach, is done by that team. Number 2, that team does work, particularly now post the preliminary memorandum of terms, directly with each of these applicants to help organize the ecosystems and the intermediaries and the systems that go along with trying to create these pathways. Workforce, after I left KKR, I spent the next 4 years solely focused on workforce. It's something I'm passionate about. And our team helps on the ground these companies to execute on that vision. And then the final thing I'd say about workforce, over in our R&D side, in our NSTC that is being created, this public-private partnership that's being created, there will live a workforce center of excellence that is meant to take best practices across the country and make sure that on a consistent basis, we're leveraging that and getting that out in the system so that this is not a one and done. This is a long-term effort to build the talent pipeline for the semiconductor ecosystem over decades.
It's one of those interesting points on the workforce, and I think it plays into the broader market dynamics, the economic theory of where you see specialization of certain things in certain countries. And in the US, it feels like we've fallen behind on a lot of the engineering tasks and something that would fall under this umbrella. When you think about approaching that problem, how big of a hurdle is it to clear? I think that's one of the common things that people would point to in terms of the challenge here is getting the workforce, getting them to be at a compensation level that they're comfortable with to do the incredibly hard work that is required. And as you approach this, you have to think about so many different factors and angles here. Are there certain things that you can point to which you think will represent a big breakthrough in changing the workforce dynamics?
I honestly wish I could tell you that there's a silver bullet here. There is not. Having spent a lot of my post-KKR years on workforce, it is very clear that workforce is the kind of industry that you have to be at it on a local level every day in a lot of detail. It is about building relationships. It is about building a curriculum. It is about broadening your funnel and going out and convincing and having people understand why it's super cool to work in the semiconductor industry. And you shouldn't just think about software and all of that. This is an all of the above approach. And the good news is that what we're talking about is one industry across multiple geographies in the US. The nature of the jobs are clear. We have very good alignment from many, many entities across these geographies, from really universities to 2- and 4-year colleges to high schools to multiple programs. And so there is a lot of innovation going on here. And we have a lot of motivated companies, which is always the critical thing in success for workforce. So we have companies that really care, that know it's going to be a critical determinant for their success and are willing to put money and effort and skin in the game behind that. And they've got us, who is not only pushing them, but also supporting them. You may have seen that in many of the announcements that we've made, we have set aside very specific dollars to go directly into workforce funding to help support the development of the workforce ecosystem in upstate New York or in Taylor, Texas, or in Phoenix and outlying parts of Arizona. So that is what it's about. It is going to be a consistent effort from all these players, including state and local economic development, workforce development groups at these state and local entities, that is going to make a difference here over many years.
We talked about workforce, we talked about environmental. Are there other common pain points when you're speaking to companies that are applying or companies in this ecosystem as they're evaluating the opportunity to build here? Are there other things that have been a common discussion point for you and the businesses that we didn't already discuss?
It's all related to what we've just said. There are upfront cost challenges that relate to not only what we've talked about, but also just a lot of building is going on at this time and a lot of equipment. I mean, even when you think about the AI boom, part of the barriers are you can't get enough GPUs, you can't get enough energy, you can't get enough gas-powered turbines to create new power plants. So part of that challenge is working through that upfront effort of getting these facilities built in the face of some of that demand. Depending on the geography, there are going to be different infrastructure challenges and opportunities. Energy actually in this country is a real opportunity. It's much more plentiful and cheap than it might be in some other regions of the world. These plants rely a lot on, obviously, energy, on water, on certain materials. Building the supply chain is something that we are really focused on. We're talking about building ecosystems here. And so I'm pretty proud that when we announced TSMC, to date, at least 14 direct suppliers of TSMC have plans to construct or expand because of TSMC. In the case of Samsung, I think there's probably 24 strategic suppliers that are either moving onshore or considering expanding because of what Samsung is talking about doing. So having the right suppliers and the right materials onshore and being able at the right purity levels and the confidence of that is also part of the challenge. So as I said, I mean, it varies depending on the applicant, depending on the region, et cetera. Certainly workforce is a consistent one, but all of this is complicated and hard.
Now that you've announced a lot of the grants and there's been several funding announcements, there is also the milestones that are important. Can you talk a little bit about the mechanisms there? Whatever detail you can give around whether there's a release of funds at various intervals or whatever it might be, but how you now go about, it's not just announcing, it's actually the build out and then tracking and working with the businesses to hit the milestones. Can you detail a little bit of that in terms of what's ahead?
Let me back up for 1 second because I'm not sure I've given the full arc of where we've come over the last 20 months to come and answer that question. So as I said, we started about 20 months ago when the bill passed. February of 2023, we put out our first funding opportunity. That was in effect the starting gun because that put out the rules of the road. We had started to develop our team, et cetera. So that was about 14 months ago. Since 14 months ago, we have received, I think we've announced most of this, about 650 statements of interest, about 200 pre-applications or full applications. And we also released a second funding opportunity for smaller supply chain where we received 160 concept plans and have since narrowed that down to a group of finalists. To date, we've announced up to about $29.5 billion in direct funding, preliminary memorandum of terms for 9 companies, and $25 billion in loans. And as I said, for approximately a little over $300 billion of total investment. So that's where we stand today. That is, we have $39 billion. We've announced just under $30 billion of that to date. And there's certain components of the rest that are sort of spoken for certain DoD requirements, for example. So we're over 80% of the dollars have been announced. And we're really, really proud of where we are and what we've done in those 14-month period. It's quite an exciting time. Now, what we've announced on these preliminary memorandum of terms are subject to final confirmatory due diligence, the negotiation of ultimate award documents, and then disbursement will occur, as you said, through milestones. Again, we are driven. We're trying to accomplish economic and national security, and we're also trying to recognize that we're doing that with taxpayer dollars, and we owe it to the taxpayer to do this, to get as much as we can for as small amount of money as possible, and to make sure we're protecting ourselves. And so all of our money will go out and be dispersed over milestones. Those milestones could vary. Many of those might be around construction milestones of when certain aspects of construction are complete, about when certain equipment is put in place or qualified. And in certain instances, it might have to do with some other milestones that are related to something that we're trying to accomplish with one or another company. Certain kind of technologies that might be moving here, certain type of customers we're looking to see commit, or others as the case may be. I'm not going to talk about specific ones, but those milestones are meant over time to be measuring progress against a upfront commercial plan that the company is executing against.
I know there's been some back and forth on this. I don't know where it actually settled out, but in terms of companies with their capital allocation plans, what they can and cannot do, how much discussion do you have with those companies? Obviously, you don't have control over them, but how much does that play a role in the initial rewards and then the various milestones in the future?
We do have very significant engagement with these companies. We are really trying to understand what their strategies are, what their pain points are, and what they can and can't accomplish, and what their success is going to be dependent on. And we try then to size our awards appropriately. We understand what the returns on their projects are going to be. We spend a lot of time trying to understand and confirm and for ourselves what the true economics of these projects are going to be. We spend a lot of time trying to determine as best as you can what demand for this facility and output is going to be. And then we all recognize, and we need to recognize, we need to be commercial about this, that this is a cyclical industry. Things change. These are complicated projects. And so we do work into our agreements a certain amount of flex to recognize that things are not going to play out exactly the way we plan. And we want to give companies a bit of that ability to flex as the markets evolve. And it comes back to something I said very early on about the alignment of interest. We're putting money side by side with these companies, and our expectation is that's the most protecting aspect of the overall program.
You just mentioned you've basically announced a little over 80% has been allocated. When you think about the future milestones to grade the program itself from here, I think of funds being allocated / rewarded as one of the first and initial plans there. What would be next in line and a reasonable time frame to monitor the next step in success here?
Well, I step back from it one further step and think about the long term. Ultimately, success is going to be measured 5 to 10 years from now by whether we were truly able to shift that curve. I'll quote again from SIA because it just came out. We are at about 10% of global capacity today. Left unaided, we probably would go down over the next 8 or so years to 8%. And SIA's projections is based on what they're seeing is we will go up to 14%. So when we sit here at 2030 and you invite me back on your show, my hope is that what we'll be able to see is a clear V in that curve in terms of what's happened on semiconductor fabrication and manufacturing. And that will be the ultimate metric. You can get into the different components. Like we have put a lot of time and effort into leading edge. Outside of Taiwan and Korea, we will be the one region. There might be some others, but the one region that truly has capacity on leading edge from almost every major player. We've already had announcements from Samsung, Intel, TSMC, Micron, SK Hynix, who's the fifth, has recently announced they're going to do an advanced packaging facility in Indiana. Like there is no other country that has more than 2 of those players that is meaningfully active. And on leading edge, logic, of course, 20% by the end of the decade. I think if you look at what Micron's doing, we probably won't get to 10% by the end of the decade in DRAM memory, but we'll get close. So a lot of those metrics are really what matters. And if it's being done in a sustainable way where these ecosystems of suppliers and research and universities and workforce and that virtuous circle comes to pass so that ultimately this CHIPS Act has dealt with the initial challenges of building and creating the infrastructure and getting over that initial hump so that these become self-perpetuating entities. That is the ultimate success of the program.
At the end of the day, the endpoint matters the most here. So I certainly understand that. You've mentioned a few times in terms of the capacity, in an ideal world, TSMC isn't building new capacity. It's maybe moving the capacity that they're already going to build and moving it into the US. In an instance where you just do see a lot of capacity coming online outside of the US, does that change anything strategically in terms of the plan for you?
Yes. I mean, I think we have to be students of the industry, of the history of the industry, and also of what's going on. I do actively monitor what is happening in China. I do think it is reasonable to see, even if you just look at the results of the equipment providers, the amount of equipment that is going into China as we speak, predominantly focused on current and mature technologies, given the guardrails and the export controls that we have in place. You have to think about unintended or even intended consequences of what you do. And that current and mature industry has the potential, particularly at certain nodes, to be oversupplied. And so all of that is part of our fundamental analysis. We are one part of a broader set of government and market tools. And we try to engage with those other parts of government and market tools to make sure that everybody's playing their role, including key customers and the key customers of the key customers who are saying, I've seen this because I've been at this for over a year and a half. Many of the customers are getting more and more focused on the fact that they need to spend some money to build resiliency, to have insurance, that they have to be mindful of where their semiconductors are coming from. Many of the auto companies have really got religion about this and are really focused on their supply chains in a way they certainly weren't a couple of years ago. Again, it's all of the above. We're not the only component here. We are one important component. There are many other components to make this overall effort successful. And I do worry about oversupply in certain parts because of economic activity that might be happening in different parts of the world.
One thing that I barely asked about was on the demand side of the equation, which is somewhat telling. But I believe as part of the stipulations for an application, there needed to be some evidence of an order book or some demand for whatever was being built out. I imagine that hasn't been a problem for most of these companies. Can you just give a snapshot on the demand picture, the customer base? Anything that you would add to what you just mentioned there, just in terms of the interest in diversification of the supply chain on top of just the run rate demand that they might have?
To your first point, we do look for and require evidence of demand, and that can take different shapes, including there are some. We look at our Global Foundries announcement. General Motors has a very important long-term agreement with Global Foundries in their Malta facility. We encourage that because we do feel that it is really important for customers to show with real skin in the game that this matters. And it is a competitive world. Customers, of course, want all the demand that they need and they want it for the same price. That's what they want. And our message is we're doing our part. We need to see customers also step up and recognize that what we've done over a long period of time is we've created true choke points in the global supply chain for semiconductors. And so it is going to take some effort to change that. It's going to take some money. It's going to take some customer action and prioritization of building a resilient supply chain. It's going to take a recognition of the complexities in this world, geopolitical, but also just, there was a big earthquake in Taiwan not too long ago. You have these choke points in different parts of the world. Those are really important for companies, boards, investors to ask about. And so our effort is to make sure that demand is there, to encourage customers as much as possible, be really thoughtful about their supply chains and to help to build that diversity and resiliency. And then we will engage, and we will, as part of diligence, understand what the true demand is underlying a given technology or fab.
Todd, this has been an excellent conversation, a great point in time to discuss everything going on here. The last question I'll ask, which is an unfortunate last question, but need to get it in there. With the election coming up, does anything change the behavior that your team has to consider with the pending election? Anything that might change around the program? Anything that you have to take into account with that coming up?
The answer is not really, no. This program, as you know, was the most, I don't know that it was the only, but it might have been the most bipartisan programs of this administration. And it has probably gotten more bipartisan as we've watched what's going on with China over the last couple of years, as well as the advent of AI, which is really, really a critical national and economic security priority. So I feel like that remains true. And then I don't think about that big P politics at all. I feel like I'm here. I have a job to do. It's been super clear that my job is about economic and national security. By the way, companies have to come to us already with a state and local incentive in hand. So we're not picking and choosing or telling people to go to different geographies or anything like that. That's already done when it comes to me. And so our team's effort is to figure out what are the best investments that are aligned with our vision for success, that are going to accomplish the most for this country and for taxpayer dollars. That's what I think about every day. My own personality is I am driven to get this stuff done as fast as possible. And so that is my task, is to continue to drive towards completion, certainly of the award stage, and to set up this office for the long term, because after the award stage comes a long period of time of engaging with, dispersing money to, helping these companies be successful in the U.S. And all of these different stages are important to the program.
It's been a fascinating conversation. It's probably the most interesting technology that runs all of our lives. So it's great to speak with you on this. And thank you again for joining us.
It's been a pleasure, Matt. Thanks for the time.
To find more episodes of breakdowns ranging from Costco to Visa to Moderna, or to sign up for our weekly summary, check out joincolossus.com. That's JoinColossus.com.